Hello. In this video, I'm going to review a couple of the Unit 2 symbolization homework problems. I'm going to review symbolization problem 112 and symbolization problem 126. And this is something I'll be doing regularly after the homework due date has passed. I'll be posting discussions of some of the more difficult problems. So we have the sentence, if Ina is chosen as campaign manager, then Rudolph will be elected if he doesn't lose the Ukrainian vote. So we want to look for our logical vocabulary. So we have here this if, we have this then, and we have this if, and we also have that not there. So this not, we know is not the main, we want to look for the main connective. And we know the not is not the main connective. Why? Well, because it's a not that's hooked onto a verb, and we have a not that's hooked onto a verb, then that's verb is the verb of some atomic sentence. In this case, he does lose the Ukrainian vote. And the not is the negation just of that atomic sentence. That's this negation convention that I talked about in one of the videos for this unit. So we know this not is not the main connective. So the question is really, is this if or this if the main connective? So let's put in some line breaks to make this maybe easier to read. So it's going to be either this if or this if that is the main connective. By the way, if you want to enter a line break, it's Control Enter. So, well, if this if is the main connective, then this would be then this if potentially could be the main connective. If we remove it, it passes the removal test. We're left with two sentences. Rudolph doesn't lose the Ukrainian vote, and if Ina is chosen as campaign manager, then Rudolph will be elected. So that if does pass the removal test. Now let's check this if. So suppose we remove this if. Well, if we do, it's hooked up with this then, so we should remove this then as well. And then we have one sentence, Ina is chosen as campaign manager, and another sentence, Rudolph will be elected if he doesn't lose the Ukrainian vote. So this if then also passes the removal test. So we have to decide which of these two conditionals is the main connective of the whole English sentence. Is it this if then, or is it this if? Well, we have this convention that says that if we have a sentence that's otherwise that would be ambiguous without a comma, then the main connective of the sentence is the one that breaks the sentence at the comma. That makes, if we say this is the main connective, then the sentence divides where the comma is. And that means that this if, with this then, is the main connective. That's the antecedent, that's the consequent, and the sentence breaks right there where the comma is. Where if this if was going to be the main connective, then this comma would have to be, where now I'm getting this mixed up. Okay, there's the comma. That's what it actually is. And it would have to be there. If the comma was there, then this if would be the main connective. Sorry, this if would be the main connective. That would be the antecedent. That would be the consequent. And this if then would be in the consequent. But that's not where the comma is. The comma is here. And that means that the sentence should break there. And that means that this if then is the main connective. So let's tell it it's a conditional. Excuse me, this if is the antecedent. And the then is the consequent. And so this if and that then have turned into this this arrow. So Ina is chosen as campaign manager is atomic R. Rudolph will be elected if he doesn't lose the Ukrainian vote. Well, again, there's an if and there's a not. And the if is the main connective because, again, the not attaches just to he does lose the Ukrainian vote. So this is another conditional. The if has been turned into the arrow. The if flags the antecedent, so he doesn't lose the Ukrainian vote goes in the antecedent. And Rudolph will be elected goes in the consequent. Rudolph will be elected is atomic P. He doesn't lose the Ukrainian vote is a negation of he does lose the Ukrainian vote, and that is Q. So if we check that, we see that that's correct. So the main thing here is seeing, okay, both of these ifs could pass the removal test for the main sentence, but we decide that this one is the main connective because it makes a sentence break at the comma. And then here, this is just another if-then sentence. So we can save that. And let's go to the other difficult problem, 0, 2, 6. So, given that it is not the case that if Richard won't, Terry will, Kit won't. Okay, so let's look for our logical vocabulary. So we have these won'ts, but those are negations attached to the verb will, and so those are small scope, low in the tree negations attaching just to atomic sentences. So we don't need to worry about those. So what do we need to worry about? Well, there's this if, this it is not the case that, and given that. Okay, so could this if be the main connective? Well, if it was, then we would have to divide the sentence. If we remove it, we should be left with exactly 2 sentences. Well, we're not. We're left with that sentence, Richard won't, Terry will. Actually, that's not even a sentence. At least it doesn't look like it. That's okay, but then the problem is we have this stuff left over. So this doesn't look all right. Maybe it will turn out to be, but certainly right now it doesn't look okay. It doesn't look like a sentence. And in any case, this is excess, right? If this were a sentence, we'd have 1 sentence, 2 sentences, and more, and that's too much. The removal test says we should be left with exactly 2 sentences, no more, no less, if we're removing an if. So, okay, what about the it is not the case that? So if we remove that, we have if Richard won't, Terry will, Kit won't. That doesn't sound like a sentence. And we have given that, and that's definitely not a sentence. So the it is not the case that is also not the main connective, because when we remove it, we should be left with exactly 1 sentence, and we're left with something that doesn't look like a sentence and more. So we're left with too much and maybe also not enough. We have more than one thing, and do we have 1 sentence? Well, this doesn't seem like a sentence, this whole thing. Maybe it is, but maybe it's not. So the it is not the case that is not the main connective. And that only leaves given that. So by process of elimination, we are already in position to fairly confidently conclude that given that is the main connective, although there was a little bit of uncertainty maybe in our conclusions about which things were sentences. Well, no, there was no uncertainty. There was some uncertainty about whether or not certain little chunks were sentences, but it didn't matter, because in both of the cases with the it is not the case that and with the if, we were still left with too much. We had maybe 1 sentence or maybe 2 sentences, but then we also had other stuff, and so we had too much in either case. Still, if given that is the main connective, it should pass the removal test, and so let's see if it does. So if we remove the removal test, if we remove this, then we have, well, if the sentence breaks there, we would have Kit won't, and then we would have this. It is not the case that if Richard won't, Terry will. Is that a sentence? It's going to turn out that it is. It might not be obvious, but note that given that is still the best candidate. Our screen's turning. Let's fix that, and also let's make sure that we don't get interrupted. That's better. So I was talking about the given that, and there was a question, is this a sentence? And I think it is. If you weren't sure, you could say, okay, I'm going to try and break down the tree. You might think, well, by process of elimination, I'm sort of forced to conclude that it is, because I know that this whole thing is a sentence. I know that the given that is the only possible candidate for being the main connective, and that would, if it is the main connective, then the highlighted thing has to be a sentence, because otherwise the whole thing wouldn't be grammatical. So we want to conclude that the given that is the main connective. So we'll put it in, and now Kit won't will go into the antecedent. The given that has become the arrow, so it's left, now that we put Kit won't into this text box and the given that is turned into the arrow, is it is not the case that if Richard won't, Terry will. So we drop it there. So we have, it is not the case that if Richard won't, Terry will. So we have the if, again, and we have the it is not the case that. So the if, again, cannot be the main connective, because if we remove it, we have Richard won't, which is a sentence. We have Terry will, which is a sentence. So we have 2 sentences, but then we also are left with the it is not the case that. So we're left with 2 sentences plus more. If the if was the main connective, we would be left with only 1 sentence, with only 2 sentences and nothing more. So the if is, oh, that's not where we want that. The if is not the main connective. So what about the it is not the case that? Well, if we remove it is not the case that, we're left with if Richard won't, Terry will. And that looks like a sentence. So The it is not the case that is the next thing to symbolize. So the it is not the case that is turned into the negation sign. And so if Richard won't, Terry will goes in this text box. So now we have if Richard won't, Terry will. This is a conditional. Richard won't goes in the antecedent. That's a negation of Richard will. And Richard will is atomic. Terry will is atomic T. Kit won't is atomic for, is a negation of, Kit will. And Kit will is atomic X. Let's check it. Yes. Okay, so there we go. That's symbolization 026. So I've discussed those two challenging symbolizations. If there are other symbolizations from the homework you'd like me to discuss, I can if you'll post online, letting me know which ones you'd like me to discuss. So there you go. Hope that was helpful.